Hello and good afternoon. We are Mari and Cristian, students of the Master Degree in Computer Science. Through this video, we are going to describe the main characteristics of the database that we select, the subject of our database, how the data was obtained, what was the objective of the design of this, and finally, we will present 5 specific hypotheses and 7 statistical hypotheses that we arrived at after analyzing the database in detail.
First of all, the first topic we will start talking about is the origin of the database and its purpose. And the disease that the database focuses is systematic lupus erythematosus, a disease that mainly affects young people. It is more common in women than in men. The data were collected and recorded through measurements and clinical tests performed during routine visits with a pediatrician. The study is focused on young patients, children, and adolescents of different races, ages, and regions of origin. The database is currently being used to work on the development of a master thesis. Dr. Raúl Gutiérrez Suárez is the pediatrician who initially provided the database to work with it. The objective to be reached using the database is to find a relationship between the presence of antinuclear antibodies and other initial symptoms of the patient. Measurement values of chronic damage measurement by SLICC, acute damage measured by SLEDAI, and quality of life of the patient measured with CHQ.
To detail the description of the database, we will use some documents attached to it for a better understanding, since there are some medical terms that are said since this point that are not complicated, but that we will explain so that everything is clear in the general description. But let me share my screen to see the database. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. As we can see in the database, it has a total of 134 patients. 134 patients. These patients are from Mexico, United States, Japan, and the European Union, from different age of ranges of age, with a distribution of 116 females and 18 males patients. In total, there are 170 attributes divided in 7 main groups, where each group differs from others by using different colors per group of columns. For example, you can see a color of this and other colors that we will explain next. To begin, sorry. Okay, the variables in light yellow color represent our demographic variables per patient. Among the demographic variables, we have so much as the country of birth, sex, race, duration of disease, among others. Some of these categorical variables and some others are numerical.
Up to this point, we want to emphasize that we are going to talk about variables using the general groups, since there are many single variables. However, the meaning of each attribute is found in the second sheet of the Excel file.
This is the second sheet.
Okay. The variables in bright yellow color represent the variables that describes the initial symptoms of the patients who were admitted. These variables can only take 2 categorical values, yes or no. Within these, we can find some symptoms such as fever, weight loss, among others. And that's the region of bright yellow color. The variables in light orange color describe the medical conditions necessary for a patient to be diagnosed with lupus. This considers that the patient needs to present at least 4 of these 10 variables. And as in the previous case, the variables are categorical except for summa ACR, which is numerical and it's responsible for the total sum of medical conditions.
Okay, it's important in this point that all the variables in summa ACR are values with greater value than 4. That is our umbral region for consider a patient with lupus. Our fourth group is the pink variables, which belongs to the group of measurement instruments called SLICC or SLICC, which allows measuring chronic damages in patients. This instrument is validated by the American College of Rheumatology. The columns are constituted in such a way that they are divided by the analyzed system. For example, the first column in pink are related to the analysis of the eye damage, where the first column indicates if there is an ocular condition. The second column indicates the score acquired using the SLICC tool, depending the number of conditions that you have. And the remaining columns indicated the presence or absence of possible conditions measured with SLICC. The last columns in this section, where is the last column? This column. The last column in this section corresponds to the final score obtained depending on the rubric used and the condition registered in the different systems.
Okay. Our fifth group corresponds to the orange variables. As in the previous case, this belongs to a measurement instrument, but in this case, focus on measuring acute damage. This instrument is called SLEDAI, SLEDAI, or Systemic Lupus Erythematosus Disease Activity Index. In this, the structure is similar to the previous two, with the difference that of the 22 criteria that are used to qualify the damage in each system, some have different scores than others. For example, if a patient has seizures, 8 points are added to his final SLEDAI score, while if he has fever, these symptoms only add 1 point to the final score. And as in the same case like SLICC, the last column of this section corresponds to the final score obtained depending on the rubric used, the conditions registered in different systems. That's that column.
Okay. Our sixth group corresponds to the brown variables. Give me a moment. In this group are those variables focused in measuring the functional and emotional components of the quality of the life, among which are global health, physical condition, mental health, among others. To measure these values, the criteria of the CHQ instrument are used.
Yes. And finally, the seventh and last group corresponds to the record of the presence or absence of antinuclear antibodies. These records have obtained using clinical analysis, and these variables are the ones that we want to pay special attention to in order to find a possible relationship between them and the groups of attributes mentioned above. In total, there are 9 autoantibodies, and the register depends just if it's positive, the presence, or negative. Having described the entire database in detail, many of our hypotheses can be concluded in this database, but let's them define it formally.
Okay. Take me a moment to go to the presentation of the hypothesis. Okay, for this case, we have two different types of hypotheses, the statistical hypothesis and the scientific hypothesis. Let me begin with the first scientific hypothesis. Lupus affects in a bigger way the people with a smaller age. With this hypothesis, we think that lupus in general affects to the distribution with lower age. All of our distribution is focused in teenagers and people with a small age around the 10 years to the 22 or 23 years. This is the range of years.
Other groups of variables different to the original estimation could be used to determine if a patient has lupus. Here we want to prove that even having the certain that using ACR criteria to determine if one patient has lupus, we want to prove that using the other groups, the other 6 groups, we can know if a patient has lupus or is able to has lupus.
It's important to remember that our groups are in the data sheet are divided by colors, as you can see in the previous part. The longer with lupus reduces the quality of life of people based in PHS and PSS indicators. PHS and PSS indicators are part of the quality measurements in the brown group of variables in the datasheet. The idea of this hypothesis is that if the person has lupus, the value of PHS that is focused in
Physical.
physical, sorry, I confused. Physical part of the person, and PSS that is focused in the psychological part of the person have improved or decreased, and how this impacts in the patient.
The duration of the disease is less when the patient has a lower age. Here we want to focus more on the age onset of the patient, the age when the patient started to present the disease, and is related directly with the duration.
Okay. SLEDAI and SLICC, that are the measurements that we saw previously, are efficient instruments of measure that captures how delicate is a patient based on function of other variables. As you remember, these functions are related to one specific group. I don't remember the colors of this group. I think that are pink and orange. But the main idea of this is that is how all the other variables have impact, have a biggest impact in the SLEDAI and the SLICC measurement.
We can use the information in the database to find a relationship between the presence of antinuclear antibodies and other variables. Here is the main hypothesis that Dr. Gutierrez Suarez wanted to attack, and in this perspective, we are taking the antinuclear antibodies presence or absence as an independent variable, and the other variables, the other groups, as dependent variables.
Okay, next, for our statistical hypothesis, we obtained a total of 7. However, the document has too many variables for which many could be concluded. However, we decided to focus only in the 7 that has the most important features. And in conclusion for this, are the more important variables to consider in the study of our statistical hypothesis. The first is, let me a moment. Okay. SLEDAI score, that is the acute damage, is our variable that we will use in this statistical hypothesis. The formal sentence for this hypothesis is the probability that a patient whose SLEDAI meter is equal to 7, that is the mean, is equal or greater than 50%.
Okay, as in the previous case with SLEDAI, now is with SLICC or SLICC score that measures the chronic damage, and the sentence is The probability that a patient whose SLICC method is equal to 1, that is the mean, is less than 50%. And we are focusing this 50% because we want to prove, or we want to determine if the distribution of the values is uniform.
Yes, that is a reason what we selected three important words in this part: equal or greater than, less than, and in the last part, our hypothesis is based in diagnosing lupus. It's important to remember for diagnosing lupus, this is the sum of the like orange variables, and formal hypothesis is the probability that the sum of ACR classification criteria is equal than 5 in patients.
Measurement of physical summary score, or PHS. The value of the PHS is greater in patients with bigger age than 20 years than patients with a smaller age. Here we want to prove that the disease, lupus, affects in a lower amount to the patients that are more than 12 years old.
For the psychological summary score, or PSS, the value of PSS is greater in patients with a smaller age than 12 years. In this case, we have the opposite case that in the previous case. In the other case, we are focused in physical, I don't know how to say that. Well, in the physical part of the patient, and in this part is focused in the psychological part of the patient, are inversed because probably a patient with less than 12 years, in this case it's a child, a very small child, doesn't look the biggest impact in the psychological part than, for example, a teenager with 15 years, 16 years, that is, what is the word?
Lockdown.
Sorry. Lockdown?
Yes, lockdown, or maybe limited in these day-by-day activities.
Yes, the idea is that if the patient with a bigger age is limited in a lot of things that he can do, sorry.
Age of onset of the patient with obtaining the disease. Age onset is the name of the variable, and the one with capital letters. And the patients with a lower value than 11.6 years, that is the mean two, has bigger presence of antinuclear antibodies. This hypothesis is related to the main objective of the thesis that is working with the database. That is, try to relate the presence of antinuclear antibodies with other variables, in this case with the age onset.
Okay. And finally, we focus it in the variable ID RASA. ID RASA represents the patient race, and we use this variable to conclude the hypothesis that is the patients from Asian race have a bigger probability to have less score in the different metrics of evaluation, SLEDAI and SLICC, than other races. We think that this hypothesis is correct because the patients from Asia are normally the patients with less diseases around the world. Other comment for this, Mario?
No, it's just to mention that in this case, the score of SLEDAI or SLICC, both of them, the less the score is, the less comorbidities or the less symptoms the patient has. So it's directly related with the purpose that my partners mentioned before.
Okay, and with this, let me end the presentation. Okay.